Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and welcome to the ICANN86 Readout, Highlights and Takeaways from the Policy Forum. My name is Lars Steffen. I'm the Head of Digital Infrastructures and Resilience at the ECO Association, and I welcome you to the 17th edition of this webinar format that we've been holding since 2020. And of course, this webinar is, like always, a close collaboration with ICANN. Our hosts today are Gabriella Schittek. She's Stakeholder Engagement Director Europe from ICANN. Welcome, Gabi. And of course, like always, Thomas Rickert. He's the Director Names and Numbers at the ECO Association. And like always, we have a great lineup of speakers who will report from their respective constituencies. So we will have with us Nicolas Caballero. He's the chair of the GAC. Welcome, Nico. He's the chair of the risk supporting organization. Also with us, Disspain, member of the ccNSO Council. Philippe Fouquart, he's the chair of the ISPCP. Mohan, chair of the SSAC. Susan Payne, chair of the GNSO Council. Welcome, Susan. Natálie Terčová will join us in a moment. She's a member of the ALAC leadership team. And last but not least, Sarah Wyld, vice chair of the Registrar Stakeholder Group. This, I would like to open the floor for the readout and hand over to Gabriella. Gabi, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining this ICANN86 readout. Also, huge thank you to ECHO for organizing this for the 17th time in a row. That's fantastic. Thank you so much. So the ICANN Policy Forum is, as the name states, a forum dedicated to policy. It's held mid-year, and we're trying to maximize the days we're meeting for the supporting organizations and advisory committees to focus just on policy work. There are no board meetings, there are no public fora, so I cannot really report back on any interesting board resolutions or huge topics that were discussed. However, I would like to mention our Eurospace meeting. This is a meeting we're trying to organize every time we're in Europe. It's dedicated for the European stakeholders. We're trying to discuss topics that are interesting for Europeans. At this meeting, we did speak about recent regulatory developments in the EU. We spoke about the upcoming ITU plenipotentiary meeting on possible resolutions and topics that can touch upon ICANN and the technical community there. We reviewed the WSIS outcomes, and we also had the Irish GAC speaking about the Irish EU presidency, which is starting now in July. Otherwise than that, over these 4 days in Seville, we had 116 public sessions. We had 1,337 participants joining on site, representing 124 countries and territories. We had almost 550 virtual participants as well. On one of the social events, we had a small recognition ceremony for our working group chairs, and in total we recognized 61 working group chairs. That's a lot. So you can see ICANN is up to a lot right now. And we also had a memorial gathering for the ICANN board member, Alan Barrett, who sadly passed just before ICANN86. Alan was appointed by the Address Supporting Organization to represent them on the ICANN. And with this memorial gathering, we wanted to say thank you for his service to ICANN. That's all that I had to report. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Gabi. I know that Hervé wanted to say a few words regarding Alan as well.
Yeah, thank you very much. Alan, definitely. So for the ISO, he was pilier. He was part of the ISO-SC. He has been the CEO of the Afrinic pioneer in his country regarding ISP, so South Africa, and domain name also. It's something. Of course, he has been appointed by the ISO-SC, so the organization I am the chair of, to be part of the board of the directors of the ICANN, and that's a decision we never regretted because he made a wonderful job within, taking in charge very quickly a lot of dossier within it. And definitely it's what I say during ICANN86 is so it was a very brutal news, very unexpected, and it's very difficult to speak about in the past. So all our folks, to his family, of course, to his wife, and may he rest in peace. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Hervé. Before we dive into substance, I suggest we take a few moments of silence to remember Ellen, and then we start the discussion. Thank you, everyone. The meeting in Seville was dominated by two topics that absorbed a lot of the agenda. And you will see that if you look at the meeting agenda, there were several sessions dealing with the PDP number 1 on DNS abuse and the SSAD supplemental recommendations team. So I assume that the time spent on today's webinar will be dominated by these topics as well. I think that a lot of folks will want to chime in on these, but also we're going to talk about human rights, about the review of your reviews. We're going to give a little report on the ISPCP outreach session. ICP2 is going to be discussed by Hervé and others. We're going to chime in on universal acceptance, a short slot about the new GTLDs, and AI. If we can get to all of that, but I trust we will. So as you can see, we have a very interesting program for you today. I hear that we have 125 attendees that have signed up for this webinar. And you also have the opportunity, as Lars said, to chime in with your remarks. Please avail yourselves of that opportunity. But first, we're going to have one rapporteur, if you wish, one primary speaker for each topic, and other panelists will chime in. The first topic on the agenda is going to be DNS abuse. And Susan Payne is going to report a little bit about the PDP working sessions and the progress made so far in this policy development process.
Thanks very much, Thomas. Indeed, this DNS abuse PDP1 is on associated domain checks. And I think, as Thomas was indicating, it's one of the GNSO's current policy efforts that's probably getting some of the highest level of community interest. And really the issue that's being addressed in this PDP is that currently, where a registrar has credible evidence that a domain name has been maliciously registered and is being used to perpetrate DNS abuse, they are under no obligation to investigate whether there are other associated domains in that same registrar or customer account that might also be abusive. And so while some registrars may undertake such an investigation, there is no obligation on them to do, and consequently, this means it's not something that ICANN compliance can either investigate or enforce because it's not a requirement. So the DNS abuse PDP1 is looking into that and began its work at the ICANN85 meeting, so just in March, and really has already made significant progress in the few months since then. So going into the ICANN86 meeting, there was already draft text for recommendations on the majority of the charter questions, and the representatives of the participating groups had already been asked to identify this draft text and identify anything that they couldn't live with or that they could live with, but they would still like to see some changes to the text. During ICANN86, then, the working group held 4 working sessions, and they used this time both to discuss these can't live with concerns, and in many cases were able to reach some resolution or compromise language that would address the concerns in question. And then also used quite a large amount of the time in Seville to develop draft language on the 2 final charter questions where there wasn't already language in place. And those 2 final questions deal with how should the effectiveness of the policy be determined and how should registrars demonstrate compliance with the policy. So I think in terms of how do you measure effectiveness, generally there's good support in the working group for some kind of periodic review. And the working group really seems to be coalescing around having this first review begin at around the 2-year mark from the policy going live, it would be. But it was also noted that it will be really important for ICANN to begin establishing baseline data promptly so that there's something that can be reviewed against. There was also, I think, fairly good general agreement that any review ought to consider both qualitative and quantitative, I can't say that word, factors. So including things like whether ICANN compliance are actually able to assess compliance, whether the policy has led to improved consistency of registrar practices, obviously whether registrars have indeed been doing the associated domain checks, obviously, and indeed also something that looks at kind of developments, whether there should be any revisions to the guidelines to take into account things like changes in how abuse is perpetrated over that time period. In terms of how should registrars demonstrate compliance, the draft recommendations are envisaging that obviously that registrars must be able to do. They should be doing so using records and documentation maintained in the ordinary course of their business, with the specific format for that documentation really being left very much to a registrar's discretion. But again, so in the course of the meeting, really good work done on pulling together some principles and getting some draft text out to the working group for further sort of review and consideration. I said also there was quite a bit of discussion on can't live with items from the draft recommendations on the other charter questions. And there are, I think, a few areas where there's still a bit of follow-up work to do. But in many cases, as I said, the group does seem to have been able to coalesce around draft text. So one of the areas where there's still, I think, a bit of an outstanding issue it relates to the trigger for associated domain checks. And the draft language for the recommendation talks about actionable evidence that the domain is being used for DNS abuse pursuant to section 3.18.2 of the Registrar Accreditation Agreement. And something that SSAC Public Safety Working Group representatives have raised as a concern is how does that concept of the domain being used or is being used for domain abuse, how does that pick up the concern about a domain that maybe has been used in the past, but at this present moment in time is not being abusive, or even domains which maybe are not yet abusive, but they share identical characteristics of other abusive domains. So some suggested alternative language is being proposed, which is instead of is being used, it should be was being used, is being used, or matches an established pattern of abuse. There seems to have been some support for that during the discussions in the working group, and some willingness to workshop this language and try and find something that would be workable. There was also some comment and note that really that's an issue at the original abuse level, in the sense that the existing contractual obligation about active on unmitigated DNS abuse relates to a domain which is being used for abuse. And there was some views expressed that actually if a fix is needed for this, it's really a fix that's needed at that original abuse level, rather than when you're talking about fixing it just as a trigger for an associated domains check. But that's, I think, one area where there's still maybe a little bit more discussion to be had. Another outstanding item, which the registrars and IP representatives are going to meet on later this week, relates to the reasonable investigation that a registrar could conduct. The recommendation proposes that this must consist of reviewing information which is reasonably accessible to the registrar in the normal course of their operations. And that's got good support from the group. But there's also some implementation guidance to support this, which identifies various different sort of pieces of data that might be considered reasonably accessible. And the IPC representatives at the moment are saying that they'd like to see these data points, particularly the ones relating to data that's gathered under an ICANN agreement or a consensus policy, or that a registrar has in pursuant to applicable law, that they should be given the status of actual policy recommendations and not merely implementation guidance. The argument being that if this data is something that the registrar has a requirement to have, then surely it must meet that reasonably accessible standard. I think on the other hand, on the registrar side, there was some concern expressed that might be data which they might physically have but may not have the tools to interrogate, and questioning that might need some kind of developer work, and would that be something that should be expected of them? But generally speaking, I'd say there are still some issues to work out, including the ones I just mentioned. I think that the working group is working really collaboratively. It's making good progress, and it seems to be, certainly it appears to be pretty far ahead of the timeline that was set in the work plan. And so it does seem to be entirely possible that the draft report with the initial set of recommendations that would go out for public comment could be ready within the next sort of couple of months or so, and therefore much sooner than the Q1 of 2027 that was being envisaged in the work plan. So really, really good constructive work happening during Seville, really, as I said, collaborative and good working sessions, and a lot of progress been made.
Thank you so much, Susan, for this comprehensive report. Chris, do you agree with Susan's assessment that we're making good progress?
Oh, absolutely. Yes, I do. And you do too, Thomas, because you're there.
I do.
And Sarah, I think. Yeah, I did. Look, it's been a wild ride so far for some of the CC folks who've never experienced a GNSO PDP before. But I can't really add much to what Susan said. It really has come together remarkably well. Yes, there are areas of disagreement, and there may be larger areas of disagreement to come. But for now, there seems to me to be a genuine willingness on the part of all of the various different bits of the GNSO, to come to the table and see if we can find ways through, which is why in Seville, when the call for things you can't live with happened, there was a list of things people couldn't live with, which slowly evaporated over the sort of 2 or 3 days of work. So it seems to me to be going pretty well.
That's great. And before we move to the next topic, I can't resist saying 2 or 3 words as well. I think that a lot of the discussions that we had were because of the fact that working group members conflated discussions that should happen within the PDP and things that happen outside the PDP. So that might sound a little bit blurry. What I mean by that is that a lot of the concerns were referring to action taken by a registrar in taking down domain names, for example, that have been identified as part of a campaign, a phishing campaign, for example. But that is not part of this very job of the PDP working group, right? So we're just looking at what triggers an associated domain check, what parameters should be in place so that a registrar is required to do that, with the consequence that ICANN compliance can go after the registrar if he fails to do that. But the actual measures to be taken once you find more domain names in your portfolio are not being handled here. And this is something that we might push back to the GNSO Council so that, for example, recourse mechanisms are being considered so that aggrieved registrants whose domain names are being taken down, probably wrongfully in the eye of the registrant, have a mechanism to challenge that and to get that rectified if it's proven to be unjustified. The other thing is, and I guess this is important to be able to manage expectations, and you alluded to that, Susan, when you spoke about the review mechanism, is that we're going to aggregate statistics. So registrars are going to talk about how many associated domain checks they have conducted. So if we get an aggregate number after a year or something, what does that mean? If there are a lot of associated domain checks, that may mean that we have an abuse issue because there's a lot of abuse. If there is not a lot, then that can mean that the policy is not effective. It can also mean that we don't see a lot of abuse. And it can also mean that perpetrators have found other ways to cheat the system because they know that mandatory domain name checks or associated domain checks are underway with ICANN. So we've asked collaboratively ICANN to actually look into this via Octo, so that Octo will be asked to gather intelligence outside the ICANN ecosystem to correlate data and to see what happened to the abuse landscape in the light of this new policy that we're developing. So that's my 2 cents on that. Nicolas, I have you marked for the DNS abuse topic a little bit later as well. And we are going to Philippe now because the DNS abuse discussions don't stop with the PDP number 1, but there's more discussion going on at the moment. So the floor is yours, Philippe.
Thanks, Thomas. I'll be very quick anyway. And I agree with the note of optimism both Susan and Chris shared in terms of how that goes. I just want to add that on a sort of broader perspective that there's been a lot of talk about how the sequencing of PDP2 and the PDP3 that are meant to deal with the sort of API part of this /bulk registrations on one hand and the domain
what's that called? Domain name search algorithms on the other. So that's the first part would be PDP2 would be focused on pretty much on registrars, and the third one would be on registries. And there was some discussion at the very closing session, or at least ours, in Seville with the contracted party house on the possibility of having some either staggered or parallel PDPs, mindful that at least from their side of things, it may involve different people. So mindful of what the CSG have said over the years in terms of this being a priority and sometimes the dependencies between these things, pending our ability to staff those PDPs and also the ability of staff themselves to provide resources and the chairs, then maybe we could, as Susan said and Chris as well, achieve all of this earlier than originally anticipated. So that's all good news as far as I am concerned. Over to you, Thomas.
Thank you so much, Philippe. Chris, do you want to come in on this one as well?
Yeah, thanks, Thomas, and thanks, Philippe. Just to say, and I agree, I was at the session with the CSG and CPH, and I agree. The only thing I would say is the fact that we have got through this so far as quickly as we have, and it's looking reasonably good, we should remember that at least in part because it wasn't as a concentrated effort on one particular thing. So I don't want us to get so excited that we suddenly start doing three things and then it all gets confused. I'm not saying that's what you're saying. I'm just saying we need to be a little bit careful. And I think streamlining it and making sure that we do it in sort of easy bite-sized pieces is the key to a fast track success, to steam through as much of this work as we possibly can. Thanks.
Thanks, Chris. Nico, and then Susan.
Thank you, Thomas. I'm not sure I agree 100% with everything I heard so far, but for the sake of time, I'll be short and sweet. Let me speak from the GAC perspective. Our focus remains on achieving concrete and enforceable policy outcomes in the DNS abuse mitigation PDP. Excuse me. So in Seville, we basically emphasize that policy triggers must be practical and that contracted parties need to take swift, proactive action to disrupt malicious registrations. And we have insisted consistently throughout the time in terms of not only GAC advice, but also things we noted under issues of importance for the GAC. The real world impact on public safety is significant. And we need data-driven measures that leave no loopholes for the bad actors. So let me just stop there. We just published the GAC communique from ICANN86 Seville, so there's a lot more there. Again, for the sake of time, let me just stop there. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Nico. Susan?
Yes, thank you. And I'll also be quick. I'll just touch on the PDP2 since it's something that's been mentioned. It was always envisaged when PDP1 was kicked off, the associated domain check one, at the same time as approving that, the GNSO Council also approved the second and of what is likely to be a series of hopefully quick but certainly targeted PDPs. And the second one was approved, but some work is still needed to finalize the charter on that one before work can commence. But in order to be in a position where at the time when the community and so on feels that capacity is there to kick off the next one, we want to actually be in a position to be ready. So GNSO staff are already working on that charter now, and we'll be looking at that in the council within the next month or so at one of our shortly upcoming meetings, so that hopefully we're in a place where we've got the charter good to go, and the moment we're ready, we can pull the trigger on PDP2.
Thanks so much, Susan. I think we should also mention that the CSG has proposed to set up a standing committee on DNS abuse, which would be another channel, if you wish, to show how seriously the GNSO takes this matter. The ccNSO does have a standing committee for a while now, and Chris is part of that. But through a standing committee, if it is actually installed, we will have an additional mechanism that could probably replace the DNS abuse small team, where the GNSO community monitors how quickly we can go, what topics to prioritize, and feed that into the GNSO Council. Nicolas, I think we're doing what we can in order to act as expeditiously as possible. You will have seen that the originally proposed timeline for this PDP was longer, so we've reduced that to the minimum possible, almost under the PDP life cycle. And you mentioned your dissatisfaction with, or that you don't agree with everything that was said. I think from your intervention, the points that you mentioned are being discussed in the group, and we're trying to address those. And if you think that there are any items where the PDP group falls short of your expectations, let's take that offline. Shoot me an email. We have enough folks on this call today so that we can re-inject your concerns through that channel. I see your thumbs up. Much appreciated. Do we have Andrew ready to talk?
Yeah, obviously really interesting discussion, and it was certainly a topic covered extensively at both of the last two meetings, in fact, but certainly in Seville. Just two comments, really. One, the inter-aisle research was really depressing, suggesting that at least 20% of GTOD registrations in 2025 were to bad actors. Yeah, so this is an enormous problem. I hadn't realized it was anything like 20%, and I think their research was suggesting it was at least 20%. And then reflecting on some of the discussions, I think in the GAC, I was quite surprised that the presentations to the GAC were suggesting that they might do something as limited as maybe email verification of a registrant, and that was maybe quite difficult or might not be that effective. Whereas again, most of the recent research suggested that decent know your customer processes have a material impact on DNS abuse from multiple parties, most recently in trial. So I was surprised that the GAC wasn't pushing the community to be more ambitious than even something as limited as email, which is quite easy to come up with a burner email account. Just an observation. I was expecting the GAC to push for something more comprehensive than that.
Thank you so much for that, Andrew. I think there's a lot that could be said about that, and it would be a great discussion starter. And unfortunately, we don't have the time today, but I'm sure that we're going to pick that up, including the analysis of the study that you mentioned that has been discussed quite a bit in the community. And I think that there are different views on the methodology and all that. So that's to be continued. Thank you so much. And I'm happy that we could make it work technically for you to chime in. And I think others should take that as an encouragement to also raise their hand and join the discussion. The next topic that we're going to cover is the SSAD Supplemental Recommendations Team. For those who don't know what the SSAD acronym means, it's the Standardized System for Access and Disclosure that formed part of the recommendations coming out of the ePDP on registration data. ICANN then conducted an operational design phase, resulting in an operational design analysis, which said that this is a system that can't be afforded by ICANN because they came up with a cost of more than $120 million. It was then replaced, if you wish, by a sophisticated ticketing system, as some have called it, the RDRS. And now the question was what to do with the previous SSAD recommendations, and the board has not adopted those, and the GNSO has agreed to come up with supplemental recommendations. So here we are. We have a small team that's been working hard on coming up with recommendations that are implementable and not busting the bank for ICANN. That team is very ably chaired by VeriScience Mark Anderson. And we also have an equally abled rapporteur for us today. Sarah, you're going to enlighten us on what happened in Seville.
Thank you so much, Thomas. Yes, this is Sarah Wyld from TCAS and the Registrar Stakeholder Group. I'll skip some of the introductory explanation that I had planned, as Thomas just covered it really perfectly.
I'm sorry. Didn't need to steal your thunder.
All is good. So at ICANN86, the supplemental recommendations team met for one full day and then 3 90-minute sessions. So far, the primary focus has been on accreditation and actually changing from accreditation to authentication, and including both law enforcement or governmental entities as well as other types of requesters in that process, as well as looking at request priority levels SLAs, so response time requirements, and the contracted parties process to evaluate requests. So already covering a good variety of useful and important topics. For the authentication piece, ICANN is also spinning up an input group that will do the technical work, which would connect in with the policy requirements and criteria that are being set out by the supplemental recommendations team. So those requirements developed by the SRT will include defining how a requester is eligible for authentication, looking at an overview of the authentication procedure, credential management policies, including lifetime renewal frequency, which is quite important for security, and then broader security requirements and processes to revoke credentials when needed. And that all goes hand in hand with the information that a registrar or registry requires when reviewing a request, information about the requester themselves, separate from but related to the information about the request. So there's a lot of moving parts that all fit together. But that input group is going to work on the tech side, considering how to actually issue an authentication credential and share information about that with the responding party in connection with or through the SSAD. It's a lot. So overall, the meetings were very productive and really amicable. And I came out of it with a real sense of, I would say, cautious optimism. And I think that is shared by the entire working group, SRT. The group is really focused on getting to the core of what is necessary and useful in those requirements and paring down any extraneous pieces that we actually don't need to implement, which would reduce costs and resource requirements. The chair of the group is Mark Anderson from VeriSign. He's a longtime ePDP and RDRS participant. And so far, he's doing, I think, a great job of keeping us on track and in scope, but also supporting the group in exploring new ideas where appropriate. So that's that.
Thank you so much, Sarah. And again, sorry for stealing part of your presentation. I didn't mean to do that. Nico, do you want to come in for the gag?
Absolutely. Thank you for that, Thomas. And thank you, Sarah, for your remarks. So for governments in general, registration data accuracy and timely access, let me stress that timely access are top public policy priorities, as everybody most probably know at this point, right? The GAG remains focused on ensuring a robust 24-hour timeline for urgent disclosure responses to basically support law enforcement. And we've been very vocal about this for the last 2 or 3 years at least. We are closely tracking data from the Registration Data Request Service, our RDRS. Please correct me if I'm wrong, but again, Registration Data Request Service, RDRS, to help refine this framework. And we are also eager to continue the dialogue with the board and the GNSO, as we talked about this with Susan and the board, on tightening however we can. We don't have a magic formula yet, but basically to tighten the current 15-day registrar verification window as it is currently vulnerability exploited for DNS abuses. Again, this is public information. The numbers are there. We all have access to the same sources of information, so we're not reinventing the wheel here. And that's basically it. Back to you, Thomas. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nico. Just to say that we're going to experience a historic change in disclosure request handling in August when the e-evidence regulation is coming into force, because that's for the first time in history that there's a structured approach for non-domestic law enforcement authorities to request data from service providers in other countries. And we need to make sure, and this is a point that I made on day one of our sessions, that we don't create competing obligations with different timelines for the same actors that have a legal obligation to disclose under this regime. Certainly that's not globally applicable, but they should not at the same time be forced to or be at the threat of being sanctioned by ICANN compliance. All right, with that, we can move to the next topic, and that is human rights. And as you can imagine, both the topic of DNS abuse, which may lead to unlawful domain name takedowns that might jeopardize free speech, we have the same issue, but on the other way around, when disclosure requests for non-public registration data are honored to those who should not get access to that information. So the topic of human rights and privacy rights being part of that is something that is important for the community, and Natálie will give us an update on that very topic. Natálie, over to you.
Thank you so much, Thomas. This is Natálie from the ALAC. And yes, I would definitely like to give you a little update on what has been happening, not only within our group on the topics on the human rights, but also the assessment, the HRIA, favorite shortcuts, the Human Rights Impact Assessment, which is basically a structured way of checking whether a proposed policy could affect people's rights. So looking at how seriously of an impact it could be, how many people that would reach, and whether it can be also undone. And doing this before a policy is finalized. And of course, I want to highlight that this is not a new ground, not a new discussion for ICANN. We know that respecting the internationally recognized human rights is something that has been adopted by, let's say, as a core value in the ICANN bylaws in 2016. And since that time, let's say the community has been trying to work to build into policy making itself to make the human rights impact assessment part of the process. This is not something quite new, which we see happening also in relation to the PDP-1. The DNS abuse policy work you have just heard about is one of the first to live policy process to run a scoped human rights impact assessment. And at ICANN86, we in the at-large, as part of our consolidated policy working group meeting, we were discussing where we want that human rights analysis to focus with respect on the end users, which is our primary focus of work. So exactly that privacy protections may differ from country to country, so that the impact on users is quite uneven as a fact across regions. And there's also the risk of creating or even over collecting personal data, and also the heavier burden we place with the policy on smaller and even less resourced registrants. So it's quite a big discussion where to draw the lines. And again, speaking from the end users, ALAC perspective, this really dearly matters for the end users, because the human rights impact assessment is how we make sure that such a policy is really designed to protect people from abuse, but also at the same time, it does not quietly harm other rights that come into place. And right now, as for the next steps, that is that the scoped assessment is open for at-large comments now. Anyone can participate. We are collecting input. So basically what to emphasize on and so forth. So if anyone would like to jump in with these discussions and contribute, we would be very happy to do so. And we have a weekly consolidated policy working group meetings happening. So that would be the overall update from my side. And I'll stop here and let others chime in. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Natálie. Philippe, you wanted to join.
Thank you. Thank you, Thomas. The only reason why I thought I may add something is not so much about the human rights assessment, but to refer to a presentation we had during the ISPCP session by Andrew Camping, who's on the call. And that was related to combating CSAM and fraud, given that I know is a non-controversial topic within the community, and that we tend to focus on the rights of the registrants, which is right and proper for us to do this, but also sometimes, and that was the takeaway from the presentation, is that sometimes it's a balance that needs to be achieved. I'll just stop here. I've shared the pointer to the presentation, as well as the correspondence details of Andrew with our NCSG colleagues who are keen on carrying out this human rights assessment. And I'm sure Andrew can help if others have an interest in being in touch with this Internet Watch Foundation. Although he didn't speak on their behalf, they took part in that presentation. I'll stop here, Thomas. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you so much, Philippe and Natálie, for this update on human rights. The next topic on the agenda is the review of reviews, which is a funny thing, a funny title. Chris, are you with us? Could you take a first step at where we are on that, since you're one of the co-chairs?
Yes, I can. Thank you very much indeed, Thomas. And what a joy to be able to talk about review of reviews. We're at the point where we are about to, we've taken some feedback from the meeting in Sevilla. We're at a point where we're about to produce by the end of next week our report for formal public comment. In essence, there is going to be, the recommendations are going to be that there should be an accountability and transparency review, that there should be a structural review, that the existing, I don't know what they're called, but they're in the bylaws, SSR, CGT, so on, should continue to exist, and be mandated in the bylaws, but with a slightly different mechanism for them coming into being. We are going to be recommending that recommendations from reviews. We're going to be recommending that once recommendations are made, that review should have an implementation review team, building on the very successful way that PDPs have been dealt with an implementation review team. We're also going to be suggesting that the review team themselves should continue to be impaneled until the board has made its final decision. In the past, there's been a challenge because things have happened like the board has questions, but the review team doesn't, quote, exist anymore, unquote, notwithstanding the fact that all the people exist in the community, but apparently they don't exist as a review team, and that's a problem. So we're going to try and fix that. And the main change, I think, is the introduction of a review scoping committee comprising leaders of the SOs and ACs, as in chairs and vice chairs of the SOs and ACs, or in some cases their designee, so that we will not have a situation where we have a bunch of people going into a room, deciding what to review and then reviewing it. What gets reviewed will be decided by the community using the review scoping team as a management tool. It doesn't make decisions, it merely runs the process, and the community itself will decide, in this accountability and transparency review, this is what we're going to review. In this security and stability review, this is what we're going to review. So in a nutshell, that's where we're at. The current draft document, which you may have seen, is going to be subject to some changes over the next week from the feedback. And it should go out to public comment at the end of next week, and we'll see what happens after that.
Sounds good. Philippe, are you happy with what Chris said, or is there anything to add?
I'll just add a couple of things. The ISPCP provided inputs to the group. I seem to understand that constituency was the only one doing so in their constituency's capacity, which was a bit of a surprise to me. Anyway, I hope that during the public comments, everyone will chime in, because that's a critical element of the bylaws, and there was the resources that were spent in ATRT3, and all the reviews have to be respected to a large extent, and we'll have to make sure that the framework is fit for purpose. The other comment I would have is that most of our inputs, as Chris knows, are focused on the second bucket called structural review, on the cadence of it. Some of our members are concerned that I think it's 15 years, every 15 years, and is it 28 months off the top of my head, or 24 or something, which seems few and far in between. But that's the sort of inputs that we'll have, and I suspect that those will also come across in the public comments. Everyone would be curious as to know what others feel about it, other than in their individual capacity. So I think I'll stop here, Thomas. But just on the process, I think it's been a robust one. And I'm surprised at the pace of the work, given the fact that the topic is sometimes considered as being dry for some of us. But given that the output was provided in less than a year, it's quite a feat, I think. And people should be commended for that. Thank you, Thomas. Over to you.
You can leave the mic open, because you're going to be next to talk about the ISPCP outreach session. And I confirm this is as dry as can be. You need to make sure that you have water on your desk to be properly moisturized, so that you don't fall apart into dust.
It's not that dry, to be honest. And I'm glad that a lot of people managed to attend. Maybe that's telling that there were just as many people in the room as there were people attending remotely. It's always been the case in our ISPCP outreach sessions. We've done that pretty much every month over the last year. That was a collaboration with SSAC, and the session in Seville was also a collaboration with SSAC, as well as some distinguished panelists that we have on this panel as well, Sarah and Thomas, notably. So we talked about how to balance security and privacy with data, how the registrars are able, as you would probably know, under some circumstances of granting access to those data, as well as the legal framework that is applicable to both privacy data and access to them. We also provided some ISP's perspective on that, what we would normally do, and we have a somewhat limited remit in this department. So I think it was, to some extent, a companion piece of work with what the registrars did with the little game to what should be provided by those who'd like to access those data. We had good questions, and I think it was overall well attended. So I'll stop here. I hope that wasn't too dry, Thomas. But anyway, there we are. Over to you.
I was actually referring to the review of reviews as being so dry, and confirming that I think our session, the outreach session, was the best time during the ICANN week. But Sarah, you will be the judge on that. Over to you.
Well, thank you, Thomas. I have to take issue with that because obviously the best session was the registration data game show, which I hosted. But everybody who attended that one had a lot of fun and learned. But the ISPCP outreach was a really good panel discussion, and I was super impressed with the questions from the attendees. For my part, I shared some data and related thoughts about the disclosure requests that TUCAS has received from security researchers, which we get vanishingly few from that category. And if possible, I would ask, there you go, we've got the link in the chat if you want to see the stats. For me, the most interesting thing that came out of this session was the confirmation from my co-panelist, a security researcher, confirming that he doesn't really need to know who owns domain names to do his security work. What's important to know is if they're all owned by the same party. And so that felt like it really ties in nicely with the work happening in the Associated Domain Check PDP.
Thanks so much. Ram.
Thank you so much. I think from the side perspective, the biggest thing really for us is this continued partnership that we have started off in 2026. And this is one of a long series of sessions that we have been planning, and it's been delightful to be a part of it. The particular session in Seville was not only well attended, but I love the questions, the quality of the questions that came through. And from our side, we were contributing people who are experts in navigating things that relate to privacy and security. Tara Whalen, who is with the World Wide Web Consortium, was there speaking to the topic. And I don't have a whole lot more to add other than it's really great to see this kind of collaboration, cross-community collaboration, not only beginning, but thriving. And the attendance across the board for all of the sessions, not just the one at ICANN86, but all the other sessions that we've done, there's never been less than 100 people attending. So clearly the topics that have been selected are of high interest. And Lars and Thomas and others, the ISPCP has managed to find really good, compelling speakers to add to the compelling topics. Congratulations on getting it off the ground, and look forward to more.
Thank you so much for your kind words, Ram. And the recording from that session is available. So if you're interested in more details, I guess for me, the main takeaway was that, as Sarah alluded to, that we can share much more than we think we can, because a lot of the data that we're sharing is non-personal data. So if it comes to taking down domain names or websites, we can share more freely than we might think. Only when it comes to the more invasive things like trying to identify perpetrators or attribute attacks to an individual or to entities, then we might need more information where we need to be a little bit more cautious when it comes to the privacy rights and other rights involved. Next topic we're going to hear about is ICP2, and Hervé is with us. Hervé, enlighten us, and maybe for those who are not familiar with the topic, you can say what the acronym actually means.
Exactly. Thank you, Thomas. And so with the ICP2, we are very happy as for the ISO to be finally known since 2023, finally, because of his work. ICP is Internet Coordination Policy 2, because there were 3 such a document. The ICP2 per se was adopted by the ICANN in 2001, so it's a quarter of century since. And these governance documents list the criteria for the creation, the recognition of regional internet registry. Regional internet registry, the ICANN86, like the AFRINIC, for instance, are the organization responsible for the allocation and the management of the IP addresses resource and the number of autonomous systems as well. We have been asked by the group of the CEOs of the regional internet registry in 2023 to update this document because it was an old one. And to be honest, because there was some governance issues within the AFRINICs since, so it was seen necessary to update this document. As I said, we started this work in 2024. There have been since some consultation and within the communities of the regions and within the community of the ICANN as well, because regarding the IP addresses management and policies, best policies are developed none within the ICANN, but within the region. That's a little different position we have within the ISO compared to the other organization of the ICANN as well. To come back specifically to ICANN86, all the group, so the group of the ISO-AC, the representative of the regions, have been there to trying to complete the update of the ICP2, which is called the governance document or the draft document, because we have at this moment no specific idea that will be the final title of the document. In ICANN, that could be the reason why some session has been dry, as you say, because in this ICANN86 there were a lot of organization or working group working, definitely. And the ISO-AC member had absolutely no time to participate in the other session. We had, during these days, 15 working group sessions to discuss the updated draft. One open session within this 15 working group was an open one to demonstrate our work. During this working group session and during this session, there were discussions with the ICANN team to get clarity on ICANN role and responsibility. And there were at the end of the week an information session to provide an update. And then, after this work of completing the document, the ISO-AC is planning to submit the document to the NRO-AC, which is a group of the CEO of the regions, in the coming weeks. So, I will say it normally, but we never know, there could be the last ICANN meeting all the ISO-AC is meeting in the specific task on the ICP2 update. And I say normally, because I am not the one who decides exactly when the document will be adopted by the ICANN at the end. The output of this meeting will be a document which will be called the governance document version 3. And I can list an overview of the pending changes regarding this document. There is something about the definitions, and the list of definitions has been updated to include terms of compliance review and remove the terms that no longer applicable to the document. The structure of the document has been redefined to improve the flow of the reading of the document. There was something about the recognition process, because the old on the first ICP2 was only dedicated to the recognition of the region, but not of the ongoing life of the region, or possibly the derecognition of the regions. About the recognition, there was a definition of the threshold of finally 2/3 majority of the region of the ICANN that have been necessary for the approval of the recognition. there was something about the compliance review. This allows for member to request a review of a region against specific provision in this document in between periodic audits. And there is a difference between audit and compliance review for a specific region as well. An emergency continuity, which is a notion that was added as well, because for specific circumstances or governance or natural disaster or anything, so we need to put in place a process to be sure that the function of the region will be still performed. And there was a discussion about derecognition as well. Rehabilitation is explicitly included as a step prior derecognition. And with that, so normally, I will say it, in Q3, Q4 2026, the region and the ICANN will complete the review of the document we have provided, and the document will be then presented to the region and the ICANN communities. And from Q4 2026, the NRO and the ICANN will begin the approval and the adoption process, including final call for comments. So I hope that people who are not very aware of the ICP2 have not been lost. I hope that we at the SOSC are totally ready to answer any question everybody could have. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Hervé. We need to speed up a little bit. We have Nico and Philippe to comment, and I would like to ask you to keep it brief. Nico first.
Thank you so much, Thomas. As a matter of fact, that was exactly my point. I would be short and sweet again, mindful of the time. So just to say that in general, while the ICP2 update is driven, as was brilliantly explained by Hervé before, is driven by the ASO and the RIR communities, right? The GAC basically follows this closely from a, let's say, global public policy angle, if I may. Our main interest, as we always say, is ensuring that any revised principles for regional internet registries reinforce, let's say, the overall stability and transparency. And I would say also, I would add institutional accountability of the internet numbering ecosystem. I don't need to go into the details. Everybody knows what I'm talking about, the whole Afrinic situation and the problems. And as a matter of fact, the GAG also referred to that in our communique, the one that was published last Monday. But again, in general, we strongly believe that sound regional governance is vital to maintaining a secured and unified global network. And again, we provided some comments under issues of importance in the GAC communique. So in case you're interested, please, the GAC communique is available on the GAC website. Thank you. Back to you, Thomas.
Thank you so much, Nico. Philippe?
Thank you, Thomas. I'll be very quick. The ISPs have been very supportive, unsurprisingly, of the updates. And this taking that long is just evidence that was necessary. I think we provided inputs of substance very early in the process. I have no doubt that we will support this moving forward. We're hopeful that the regional internet registries can endorse this. And as Nico said, we also consider that will be a sort of stabilizing factor, if that's an English word, in Africa where it's needed. And I would hope, as a closing note, that other constituencies also chime in on this, just to, even if only to express some support to the initiative and to the end results, because again, that's critical. I'll stop there. Thank you, Thomas.
Thank you so much, Philippe. The next topic is going to be universal acceptance, and I know that Natálie is going to talk about that.
Yes, great. So I just have a couple of updates. I'd like to be brief, but just to remind everyone, universal acceptance, basically speaking about the fact that every valid domain name and email address should work everywhere in any language, script, or length. This is something that has been a huge focus, not only from the at-large community, but also, of course, other constituencies and working groups. But at the ICANN in Seville, there has been a couple of updates. One is that the existing UA expert working group has produced a number of practical guidelines, over 40, honestly, on the UA implementation. And now they are open for public comments, and they aim to publish the final set in July to help people in the regions to implement the area principles. We even held at large plenary where we tried to frame UA now as a policy challenge. So basically bridging the gap between the technical, let's say, readiness and the real world adoption. And we heard from the regions heavily the experiences of the people from the regions, the different organizations, and about their UA initiatives, outreach activities, and what they found out regarding to the readiness and implementation. And of course, we were discussing a lot the emerging market experiences where basically the lack of UA is still blocking digital inclusion and local content. There also has been a UNESCO policy brief. They did in joint capacity with ICANN. Very interesting statistics right there. And I encourage you to read it. And basically the next step now is that the guidelines that I mentioned should be finalized in July and then move to the implementation phase itself. And we as the at-large will keep pressing on the readiness, email readiness, to try to close the gap with the support we can. That would be briefly from my side. Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much. Ram, I have you next.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I want to speak about three things in here. First is universal acceptance is not just an important human problem. It's also a problem that stops digital inclusion. And so the Coalition for Digital Inclusion, CODI, is very interested and involved in the areas that include how to make language inclusive and how to really truly build a multilingual internet. But the foundation piece for a multilingual internet is universal acceptance, right? So there is quite a lot of work that CODI is doing. The biggest thing that CODI is just about to announce is the completion of its first project on the creation of a minimum viable data set, MVD, a minimum viable data set that will allow AI engines to ingest that data set and become facile, become competent in a given language. So that's never really been done in that scale. And so we're just about to release that. And our expectation is that if we do that in the right way, and if it is adopted by AI engines, we might be able to take the underrepresented or other languages that are simply not represented on the internet at all. And if they create those minimum viable data sets, AI engines might be able to access them and use them to become competent in those languages. So we think it might be a huge step forward to bridge the digital divide that is there. The other thing from the SSAC's point of view I wanted to also mention is universal acceptance, multilingualization. All of these are also foundational elements for the resilience of the internet. And from an SSAC perspective, and really from the community's perspective, we have been very interested and we are starting to work with various communities on how to improve the fundamental resilience of the internet. I just want to underline this. The definition of stability of the internet has changed. It is no longer about keeping the lights on. It is no longer about 24/7 access. It is now shifted to a model where we expect at some point of time in any part of the world that the internet will be down. There will be a significant problem with access to the internet, either human created or something that is an act of God. And so the definition of stability of the internet has to move from always keeping the internet on and always keeping the lights on to how do you quickly recover from a major incident or a significant problem. So we've just begun work on that in the SSAC, and we're starting to work with the rest of the community on that. Thank you. Back to you, Thomas.
Thank you so much, Ram. Philippe, you also wanted to come in on the topic.
Yeah, thank you, Thomas. Just very quickly on this topic, we within the ISPCP, people are thinking about suggesting the creation of we need to work on the term, a standing committee or something of that sort within the GNSO. So we may just start within the constituency and then propose it to the other SGCs. But the point is really for the short term to have something similar to others within the community in terms of working on UA, as well as very pragmatically have something that is in a position to deal with the recommendations from the UA expert group that should be produced within the next couple of months, probably, with a view to disseminating these results and making sure that the recommendations are implemented. So that's just a very jar text at this point, but I wanted to share this because if people are interested, then within the GNSO that there may be a way to support this. Over to you. Thank you, Thomas.
Thank you so much, Philippe. And while Natálie is unmuting herself, there's still a long way to go regarding universal acceptance, but we've come quite far over the last couple of years. At least we have the attention of many. And Ram, you mentioned to me many years back that in order to get the attention of company leaders, you would FedEx them letters because you know that's the only way to have a message landing on their desk with the envelope actually being opened and the letter being read. And this is something that has changed. Fortunately, folks put resources into universal acceptance, but there's still a lot of work to be done. And I thank you for your stamina and for keeping on pushing on this very important topic. We're moving to the next round, and Natálie is the first one to speak on that.
Great. Thank you so much, Thomas. With the topic on the next round of the new TTLDs, I want to highlight mainly the applicant support program, which is basically something that should help applicants who could not otherwise afford or navigate This is quite a big change from the first round happening in 2012. Now there is much more support. We knew that in that time it drew only 3 applications, while in this round we already have 75, and they are spread across all the 5 regions. And basically what the support is encompassing is that the supported applicants actually receive a large discount on the evaluation fee, plus also a pro bono help and also some sort of mentoring and training. So they really do know how to handle and operate this. And so in Seville, we even had a plenary on this again and exactly discussing that the mentoring and the help on ground in the regions is something that's truly crucial, because just cutting the fee is not really enough, because there needs to be the real localized legal and technical support, or it won't just simply reach the applicants that it was built for, which may again create some sort of a divide between who actually gets the support, and it probably won't be those with a lot of expertise or money and so forth. So this is something that has been mainly on our radar. There is also this new group, the at-large GTLD Applications Review Group, the GARC, which now should be coordinating the review across all the regional organizations. And what is really important for us is the period for comments where we can actually chime in and support with the capacity we have. So the next step for us is now to stand up this GARC, help the regional organizations to build such capacity and engage early through those comments, which would ultimately, and I believe, be the easiest way to get in. Thank you, Thomas. I'll leave it to you now.
Natálie and Susan, you're next to talk a little bit about the independent objector.
Yes, thanks, Thomas. Yeah, I just really wanted to mention this. We had one session of the implementation review team during the ICANN86 meeting, and really the topic on discussion was the independent objector. This is really a sort of final kind of holdover thing that still needs to be resolved, and actually is becoming a bit time sensitive. So the concept of the independent objector is that there should be someone, or actually in this round, that there should be 3 independent objectors who are able to file their own objections based on limited public interest or community grounds, and take those objections forward if it's something that's viewed as being in the public interest and where there isn't already some objection having been filed by someone else, that it isn't appropriate for the independent objector to be filing a duplicate objection, let's say. In the last round, we did have this concept of an independent objector, and we just had a single objector, and there were some concerns that didn't adequately allow for where conflicts of interest might arise. So this time around, there should be 3. And in fact, the call for expressions of interest for the independent objector went out in March. It had to be extended until May. And we understand that the posts are not filled yet. And whilst that might indicate kind of a lack of interest, I'm not sure that is genuinely the case. There appear to have been some quite problematic tech problems around the application process and the portal people were using, and indeed around the receipt of any questions that those interested might have submitted. And so I don't think we can automatically assume it was lack of interest, but there do seem to have been significant problems with getting those expressions of interest in. And so, although I don't think it has happened yet, the call for expressions of interest will be reopened, and it's going to stay open until basically they have 3 suitable candidates and have filled the post. So I think that's really just the main thing to mention. We did talk in the group also did talk about some high-level guidelines that have been produced that will be part of a kind of information pack for the independent objectors, and also a template for the rationale that they should produce if they're going to take an objection forward, and some conversations generally about how the process would work with the 3 of them, what should happen if there is a conflict of interest, and those kind of discussions were taking place. But I think one of the things to note is just that actually, if anyone has ever thought that they may be interested or might be interested in being an independent objector, then keep an eye out, because the call for expressions of interest will reopen.
Thank you so much. I want to adjourn on time, so Philippe and Ram have each 1 minute to talk about AI.
Oh, very quickly then, I thought you delete that one. 2 sessions at Seville, one that was extremely well attended, people sitting on the floor, diverging views on the impact of AI on domain name registrations. Data seems to suggest there's no impact. Anecdotal evidence seems to suggest that there is an impact. We've had a presentation within the ISPCP on this very topic with potential technical impacts as well in terms of AI agents not respecting TTRs, for example, as well as the criticality of training LLM on proper data, because it's all about having good data to train those LLMs, including on UA, for example. You can't expect something to be generated by AI to be UA compliant, UA friendly if the data you have isn't. Probably to be continued on this. Over to you, Thomas.
Great, thank you so much. Last word is for you, Ram.
Thank you. 3 themes that we covered on AI and its impact on DNS abuse at the plenary panel. The first is the democratization of attack and defense tools, and that there's a lot of new tools that are coming up for both sides. The second is a really important one, which is a move towards machine speed abuse. So the scale and the velocity of abuse is really increasing. And there was a good discussion about what kind of response should it also move to machine speed? And the third was a really interesting discussion about what ICANN should do with respect to AI and DNS abuse. The sentiment in the room, we did surveys, and the primary sentiment was that ICANN needs to be looking at this space quite carefully and keeping track of what's going on, but not much sentiment yet about anything that has to do with new policy development or things like that. So watch the space, more work coming. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Ram, we've reached the top of the hour, and I would like to close this meeting by thanking our excellent panelists, thanking Lars for taking care of the organization and doing everything in the background so ably, and to all of you for staying with us for 1.5 hours, and I hope that you enjoyed this. See you next time. Bye-bye for today.